The wealthy businessman leaned back in his leather chair, smirking at the tired maid standing before him. In one hand, he twirled his golden pen, and in the other, he waved a foreign newspaper covered in words she had never seen before. "Translate this," he sneered, "and my entire salary is yours. Fail, and you go back to scrubbing floors." The entire mansion froze. No one expected the maid to even try. But when she opened her mouth, his jaw nearly dropped. The story begins in London, inside the extravagant Rutherford mansion, home to one of the wealthiest families in the city. Edward Rutherford, a millionaire known for his arrogance and love of humiliating people beneath him, had gathered guests in his drawing room. It wasn't unusual for him to show off, but today his pride was about to clash with something he never imagined. Among the staff was Amara, a young African maid who had recently arrived from Ghana. She worked quietly, hardly speaking unless spoken to, but her presence carried a quiet dignity. Most of the other maids and servants treated her with curiosity. Some even mocked her for her accent, while Edward ignored her entirely. Until that evening, Edward, bored of the polite laughter of his wealthy friends, decided to make fun out of someone. His eyes landed on Amara, who was dusting a shelf in silence. "Hey, you!" Edward called out lazily. "Come here." Amara paused, bowed her head slightly, and walked over. She had learned quickly that refusing Edward meant trouble, sometimes even dismissal. When she stood before him, Edward smirked and picked up a foreign-language newspaper, a French daily, which he had no idea how to read himself. With a wicked smile, he held it up. "You clean my floors, but tell me," he laughed, "can you read this?" The room chuckled. His friends leaned in, expecting entertainment. Edward tapped the page. "Translate this headline for me. If you succeed, I'll give you my entire salary this month. But if you fail," his eyes gleamed, "you'll clean this mansion on your knees for a year." Gasps filled the room. Some thought it was just another cruel joke. Others whispered that Amara wouldn't even recognize the letters. Amara stood quietly, her eyes fixed on the page. For a moment, she said nothing. Everyone assumed she was nervous, or worse, illiterate. But then her lips moved. Softly, fluently, she began to translate word by word, her accent shaping perfect French into English. The guests froze. Edward's smile vanished. His pen slipped from his hand. And the game had only just begun. The silence in the Rutherford mansion was deafening. For a moment, no one breathed. All the guests stared at Amara, their wine glasses frozen midair, their jaws dropping one after another. The French rolled off her tongue like music, smooth and precise, each word translated into perfect English. When she stopped, she folded her hands in front of her apron, her eyes calm, almost serene, as though she had done nothing extraordinary. But Edward Rutherford, he was shaken. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. This is absurd." One of his wealthy friends leaned forward, whispering, "Edward." She spoke it perfectly. "I understood every word, and I studied in Paris for years." Edward's face flushed red. For the first time in his own home, the spotlight had turned against him. The man who prided himself on humiliating others had just been humiliated himself. But Edward wasn't the type to accept defeat so easily. He leaned forward, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "All right, maybe you memorize a few words. A trick, perhaps, but let's see how far this maid can go." He picked up a heavy book from his oak shelf, an Italian classic, thick and dusted from years of neglect. Tossing it onto the table with a loud thud, he sneered, "Translate this page, right here, in front of everyone." The guests gasped again. This was no game anymore. It was a battle of pride. Amara stepped closer. She gently placed her hand on the old book, opened the page, and without hesitation began to read. The words flowed smoothly, this time in Italian, her voice steady and confident, and then she translated it seamlessly into English, her tone carrying such conviction that even the chandelier seemed to tremble with her words. Edward's jaw tightened. His friends exchanged stunned glances. "Good heavens!" one guest whispered. "How many languages does she speak?" Another muttered, "Who is this woman really? She can't be just a maid." The whispers spread like wildfire. Edward slammed his hand on the armrest of his chair. Enough! His voice echoed, but the tremor in his tone betrayed him. He was losing control. Amara didn't flinch. She simply closed the book and placed it gently back on the table, bowing her head respectfully as though she had done nothing more than dust a shelf. At that moment, the manager of the staff, a strict woman named Mrs. Graham, rushed forward, her face pale. She pulled Edward aside and whispered, "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think you should push her further. This could—" But Edward cut her off sharply. "Silence! She's a maid, a servant. I refuse to believe she can outshine me in my own house." He turned to Amara again, his pride bleeding into anger. "Where did you learn all this? Who taught you? Speak." Amara finally raised her head. Her eyes met his, and in that gaze was a strength no one expected. "I wasn't always a maid, sir," she said quietly. Her voice carried through the entire hall. "Back home, in Ghana, I studied languages. I dreamed of becoming a translator, even a professor one day. But life—" She paused, her voice trembling for the first time. "Life had other plans." The room went silent again, but this time with awe. The servants standing by the wall stared at her with newfound respect. The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, realizing they had underestimated someone who stood taller in spirit than all of them combined. Edward's fingers tightened around his glass. His pride screamed for revenge. His eyes narrowed with dangerous curiosity. "Then let's test the limits of your dreams," he whispered. "If you're truly what you claim to be, prove it, right now, in front of everyone." He snapped his fingers, and one of his guards rushed off to fetch something from the library. A moment later, the man returned with a stack of newspapers and books in multiple languages: German, Russian, Spanish, even Mandarin. The challenge had turned into a spectacle. Every guest leaned forward, their curiosity burning. Could this maid really do it? Could she handle them all? And Amara, she simply stepped forward, her eyes calm, her voice steady, and prepared to face the impossible. The test of her life had just begun. The air inside the Rutherford mansion was so thick with tension that even the ticking of the golden grandfather clock felt like a drumbeat. All eyes were on Amara as Edward's guard laid down the heavy stack of newspapers, books, and documents in different languages. Edward leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his chair. His smirk had faded into a thin, cruel line. "If you are as talented as you claim," he hissed, "then prove it, in front of every guest here." Amara did not flinch. Her dark eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of the wealthy men and women who had mocked her only an hour ago. Now, those same eyes held curiosity and fear. The first book was opened, a German journal. A guest who had studied in Berlin nodded sharply and said, "Translate this passage." His voice dripped with skepticism, as though daring her to fail. Amara glanced at the page for only a second, then began reading aloud in German, her pronunciation sharp, her flow smooth. As she spoke, she shifted into English, delivering the translation with precision. The guest's jaw dropped. She's flawless," he whispered. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Next came a Spanish newspaper. A woman in a red silk dress, a wealthy socialite. Cross her arms. "Let's see her do this one. I lived in Madrid for 5 years. I'll know if she lies." Amara didn't even hesitate. Her voice carried the rhythm of the Spanish language, and then her English translation followed, filled with nuance and depth. The woman's eyes widened, her painted lips parting in shock. "She didn't just translate, she understood the tone," the woman whispered, almost to herself. Edward's face grew darker with every passing second. Sweat formed at his temple, though the room was cool. But he wasn't finished yet. "Mandarin," he barked. "Give her Mandarin. Let's see her stumble now." The guard shuffled to a pile and pulled out a slim Chinese magazine. The characters sprawled across the page, intimidating even for educated scholars. The room leaned forward. Even Amara paused this time, her brow furrowing as she studied the symbols. A flicker of doubt flashed in Edward's eyes, hoping, praying, that she would fail at last. And then Amara began, slowly at first, carefully shaping each word, but then with growing confidence. She translated sentence after sentence into perfect English. A Chinese guest in the corner, who had been silent all evening, finally spoke up with awe in his voice. She is correct. Every single word. Gasps filled the hall. Some servants covered their mouths. Some guests whispered as though they had just witnessed a miracle. Edward shot up from his chair, his face crimson. "Enough!" he roared, his voice shaking the chandeliers. "This is some trick, some deceit." But it was too late. The room no longer belonged to him. All eyes were on Amara. No longer did they see a maid in a plain uniform. They saw a woman of brilliance, a woman with the mind of a scholar, a woman whose true identity had been buried under poverty and circumstance. One of the older guests, a respected judge, stood up slowly. He looked at Amara with reverence. "Young lady," he said, "how many languages do you speak?" Amara's lips curved into the faintest smile. She lifted her chin slightly and replied, 7, and I'm learning my 8th. The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and awe. Edward collapsed back into his chair, humiliated beyond words. For the first time in his life, his wealth and arrogance could not silence the truth standing before him. But deep inside, his pride whispered one final thought. If she continues, she will destroy me completely. And in that moment, Edward began plotting his next move. The Rutherford mansion had turned into a courtroom. Guests who once came for wine and laughter now whispered in awe about the maid who shattered every expectation. But Edward Rutherford was not a man to lose so easily. His pride, his empire, his control over people. Everything depended on silencing Amara before the night ended. Edward rose from his chair, adjusting his cufflinks, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with venom hidden under charm. But anyone can memorize phrases. Anyone can parrot words. The judge from earlier frowned. She did far more than that. Edward, she proved knowledge. Edward ignored him. He snapped his fingers at the guard, who immediately brought out a sealed leather folder. It was old with gold clasps and carried a strange weight, as if it held secrets. Edward laid it on the table. "This," he announced, "is a contract, written 2 centuries ago by my great-grandfather. It is in a dialect so rare that even historians struggle with it." Gasps filled the room. A few guests leaned closer, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Edward's lips curled into a cruel grin. "Translate this, Maid, right here, right now. And if you fail—" He paused, letting his words sink into the silence. "You will leave this house in disgrace. Tonight." The room tensed. Amara stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she touched the ancient folder. Her eyes scanned the faded ink, the looping letters, the archaic words almost erased by time. The whispers began. "No one can do this. It's impossible. Edward has finally trapped her." But then Amara smiled. Not mockingly, not arrogantly, just a calm, quiet smile. She began reading aloud in the old dialect, her voice steady, confident. Then she translated. "This document is not just a contract. It is a confession. It reveals how the Rutherford family's fortune was built on deception, stolen land, and unpaid debts." The room froze. Every word was like a dagger, cutting through Edward's legacy. The guests gasped, servants exchanged glances, and even the judge's eyes widened with shock. Amara continued, her voice unwavering. "And it declares that should the truth ever be revealed, the wealth must return to those it was stolen from." A silence so deep fell across the mansion that even the chandeliers seemed to tremble. Edward's face went pale. For the first time, fear flashed in his eyes. One of the guests whispered, "If this is true, Edward could lose everything." The judge stood again, this time with authority. "We must see the rest of this document. If what she says is accurate, this could change the entire legacy of the Rutherford family." Edward slammed his fist on the table. "Lies! All lies!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "This woman is nothing but a servant with tricks. Do not be fooled." But no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on Amara, the maid who had uncovered a secret that could topple an empire. And deep in her heart, Amara knew this was only the beginning. because Edward Rutherford would not surrender without a war. The mansion no longer buzzed with laughter or admiration. Instead, it pulsed with fear, whispers, and the heavy weight of a truth that could destroy the Rutherford name forever. Edward Rutherford sat in his study, the door locked, the curtains drawn. His trembling hands gripped a crystal glass of whiskey, but his mind was spinning faster than he could control. "She's just a maid," he muttered to himself, pacing the room. "Just a maid. And yet she's undoing everything I built, everything my family held for centuries." He slammed the glass against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. Edward's pride was wounded, his empire threatened, and his rage burning hotter than ever. But Edward wasn't just angry. He was calculating. From the shadows of the study, his loyal advisor, an older man with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, stepped forward. "Sir, you cannot let this continue. The more she speaks, the more dangerous she becomes." Edward turned sharply. "What do you suggest, Bernard?" Bernard's lips curled into a sinister smirk. "Silence her. Permanently. If not through fear, then through force." Edward's jaw clenched. He stared at the burning fireplace as though it held the answers to his torment. "If she ruins me, the world will see me not as a man of power, but as a fraud. I can't let that happen." He poured himself another drink and downed it in one swallow. Then he leaned closer to Bernard, whispering, "Make arrangements. Tonight." Meanwhile, Amara sat in her small quarters at the edge of the estate, staring at the crumpled uniform on her bed. She had no idea of the storm Edward was planning to unleash, but she felt something in the air, a heaviness, a tension that made her chest tighten. The servants whispered around her, "Edward won't let this go. She's in danger. What if he tries to?" Amara brushed the fear aside, but her hand betrayed her, trembling as she picked up the old contract once more. She wasn't fighting for money. She wasn't fighting for recognition. She was fighting for the truth that Edward's family had buried for generations. That night, as the mansion quieted down, a black car pulled up near the back gate. Two men in dark coats stepped out, their faces hidden in the shadows. Inside, Bernard whispered into Edward's ear, "It will be done discreetly. No one will question it." Edward nodded, his face twisted with a cruel satisfaction. But what he didn't know was that Amara had already made her own plan, because the document she had read earlier wasn't the only one she had found. There was another letter, tucked deep inside the leather folder. And this one carried Edward's own signature from years ago, a confession he thought had been hidden forever. Amara's eyes burned with determination. "You wanted me invisible, Edward," she whispered to herself. "But now, you will be seen for who you truly are." Outside, the footsteps of the two men grew closer to her quarters, and the night turned deadly silent. The night air was thick with silence, broken only by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Two men in black coats moved swiftly toward the servant quarters, their faces hidden under caps. Their instructions were clear, "End this quietly, before the morning sun." Amara, however, wasn't asleep. She sat by a small candlelight, the damning document spread across her lap. Her hands trembled, but her resolve was solid. She had uncovered everything. The contracts, the hidden accounts, and most shocking of all, a confession Edward had signed years ago in a moment of arrogance. It was proof that Edward had built his empire on exploitation, lies, and the suffering of people who never had the power to speak back. She whispered to herself, "Tonight, I will not be silenced." As the door creaked open, one of the men stepped inside, his shadow covering her small room. "Come quietly, miss. It's better for you." Amara looked up, her eyes calm but fearless. "No," she said firmly. "It's better for you to leave, because I'm not alone tonight." The men froze. From outside, the sound of car engines and footsteps filled the air. Moments later, bright lights beamed through the window. Dozens of reporters, photographers, and cameramen swarmed the estate's back garden. Behind them, police officers emerged, their sirens slicing through the silence. The men panicked. "What is this?" Amara stood, holding the folder against her chest. "This is the truth coming to light." Before the man could act, the police stormed in, pinning them to the ground. Cameras flashed wildly as reporters shouted questions. The estate's gates burst open, and within minutes, the once private mansion was crawling with law enforcement and media. Inside his study, Edward Rutherford staggered to the window, his face pale as he saw the flashing lights outside. His whiskey glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. Bernard rushed in, panic written across his face. "Sir, it's over. The press is everything. The documents are public now." Edward's knees buckled. He sank into his chair, sweat dripping down his forehead. No, this can't be happening, not like this. But it was. The reporter swarmed Amara as she walked out the small servant quarters, standing tall despite the chaos around her. For the first time, she wasn't just the maid. She was a woman who had exposed the lies of one of the most powerful families in the city. A young journalist called out, "Amara, why risk your life for this?" She paused, looking directly into the cameras. Her voice steady, she said, "Because truth should never be buried. And because no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to mock or silence another human being. I was invisible to them, but tonight I am seen." The crowd erupted with questions, but her words had already struck like thunder. Edward, meanwhile, was dragged out of the mansion in handcuffs, his once polished suit now a symbol of disgrace. His face twisted with rage as reporters shoved microphones in his direction. "She ruined me. That maid ruined me." But no one listened. His empire had collapsed in seconds, not because of money lost, but because the truth had come out. Amara stood silently, watching him being taken away. Her broken arm still ached, her heart still carried scars, but her spirit was stronger than ever. For the first time in years, she smiled, because she knew the world had changed tonight, and Edward Rutherford's empire of lies had finally fallen.